Hey guys, tonight we're going to slip back into a world that feels both impossibly far away and strangely familiar. The dim, drafty bedrooms of medieval Europe. Picture this: the crackle of a fire dying low in the hearth, the glow of a tallow candle casting long shadows against rough wooden beams, and you, bundled beneath scratchy wool blankets, listening to the night hum outside the shuttered window. It's a setting that feels almost storybook, yet it's real. And here's the twist: people back then didn't just go to sleep once and wake up once like you probably do. Instead, their night was broken into two distinct chunks of slumber, with an odd, wakeful stretch right in the middle. That's right. If you ever wake up at 2 a.m. and scroll your phone, congratulations, you're more medieval than you think. Of course, you probably won't survive this night if you're too squeamish about the scratchy hay mattress, the chamber pot in the corner, or the occasional rat skittering across the floorboards. But don't worry, you won't be alone. This was the normal rhythm of rest for centuries, shaping everything from farming schedules to prayer routines. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and your local time in the comments. I want to know exactly when in the world you're listening to this. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The room you step into isn't luxurious, even though it belongs to a prosperous merchant family in a bustling medieval town. The walls are plastered but rough, painted with flacking limewash. The bed is large enough to hold more than just the parents. You'll often find children crammed in two, maybe even a servant if space is tight. Privacy is a modern luxury. The mattress, a straw-filled sack, lumpy and prone to attracting bugs. Over you lies a heavy wool blanket dyed in muted earth tones, maybe with a little embroidery if the family could spare the coin. The air feels thick. No central heating here, just the flickering fire in the hearth, and even that is fading fast. You smell the smoke mingling with damp wool, maybe even the tang of onions hung up to dry near the rafters. Outside, the town quiets. The taverns are shutting, the market square empties, and only the occasional clop of a horse's hooves echoes down the cobbles. And as the world grows still, you do what medieval people always did after a long day. You collapse into the first sleep. That's what they called it, primo somno, the first descent into slumber. Unlike your modern 8-hour block, this was a lighter, shorter stretch, often beginning just a couple of hours after sunset. Farmers, exhausted from labor, would sometimes nod off almost immediately, while the wealthy might linger longer over evening prayers or storytelling before turning in. There's a curious logic to this. Think about it. In a world without bright artificial light, people's bodies were tuned tightly to the rhythm of the sun. Darkness stretched much longer in winter, making a single, continuous sleep feel unnatural. The first sleep came easily, like sliding into a half-dream, giving your body the chance to shake off the weariness of the day. But this wasn't simply about rest. First sleep was almost ritual. Parents told children it was best to tuck in early to avoid the dangerous spirits that prowled the night. And yes, in a time when wolves or thieves might be out there, you'd probably believe them. People locked their doors with heavy wooden beams and sometimes placed charms or sprigs of herbs near the window for protection. Lavender was a favorite, though historians still argue whether that was for the pleasant scent or some supposed magical property. As you close your eyes, you hear the muffled sounds of the household around you. A servant moving quietly, banking the fire so it won't waste too much wood through the night. Chickens rustling in their coop outside, a cow shifting in the byre below. This is no silent night. Life seeps into every crack of the timber frame. Dreams come quickly. Medieval dream theory was a whole topic of its own. They believed that what you dreamed during your first sleep had a different quality than what came later in the second. Dreams early in the night were thought to be muddled, influenced by what you ate at supper or by lingering emotions. A heavy stew might give you wild, confusing visions, while a light meal could bring calm images. Physicians connected it to the balance of humors in your body, Too much black bile, and you'd have nightmares. Too much phlegm, and you'd dream of rivers or floods. Don't laugh. This was considered science. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some people deliberately tried to control the first sleep by arranging what they ate or even what side they slept on. Lie on your left, they said, and you'd encourage better digestion but risk odd dreams. Lie on your right, and your heart would be freer, keeping nightmares at bay. Imagine trying to remember that rule every night while also sharing a crowded bed with 2 kids, your spouse, and a dog. But first sleep wasn't just about closing your eyes. It was also a way to manage the unpredictability of darkness. Fires could flare or die. Intruders could sneak in. Even the weather could shift suddenly, and you might need to deal with dripping rain seeping through the thatch. So first sleep gave you a cushion, a chance to rest while still leaving part of the night ahead in case something interrupted. Historians still argue whether this segmented sleep was purely natural, something human biology drifted toward when free of modern lighting, or if it was cultural, shaped by centuries of tradition. Experiments done in the 1990s suggested that when people are placed in extended darkness, their bodies naturally shift into 2 sleeps with a waking period between. But was this always the case, or did medieval society reinforce the habit? That's one of those cozy mysteries where the truth might be both. And here where you come in. As you drift into that first sleep in this imaginary medieval chamber, you feel your body sink heavy into the straw mattress, lulled by the rhythm of a world that never fully quiets. Maybe you hear a dog bark in the distance. Maybe you dream of walking through fields you harvested earlier that day. The fire pops, the candle gutters, and shadows crawl higher up the walls. The first shift of the night pulls you down, not too deep, but deep enough. Hours pass. You sleep soundly at first, then more fitfully as your body prepares to stir. Soon, the waking hour will arrive. You'll open your eyes in the middle of the night, not groggy, not confused, but calm and alert, as if that's exactly what you were supposed to do. Because in this medieval rhythm it was. The first sleep melts away and you stir. The chamber is dark but not silent. A faint glow clings to the embers in the hearth, painting the room in dusky reds and shadows. You don't wake up groggy. Instead, your eyes open with the odd clarity that belongs only to the medieval midnight waking. This is no accident. It's the way sleep was designed in a world lit by moonlight and candle stubs. You pull the blanket tighter around your shoulders. The straw mattress rustles and you feel the lump of a stalk pressing through the cloth against your back. Children snore softly beside you, tangled in their own restless shapes. Somewhere in the rafters, a mouse scurries. It feels like you've had a full rest already, but when you sit up, you realize the night is only half spent. This was the rhythm, the first sleep after sunset, followed by a quiet wakefulness, and then the heavier, dream-thick second sleep. Modern people often assume medieval nights were all about exhaustion and collapse, but for those who lived it, this break in the middle was as natural as sunrise. The first sleep usually lasted about 4 hours, beginning not long after dusk. In winter, when darkness stretched absurdly long, the first sleep might even begin before supper had fully digested. Summer was different. People stayed outside longer, clinging to what little light remained, and the first sleep came later. Think of it like this. The medieval day didn't just shut off with sunset, it unraveled slowly. Families prayed, shared stories, or did small chores by firelight. Then sometime in the early evening, weariness settled in, and everyone gave themselves over to the first sleep. It was a kind of social pact. Even inns, those noisy hubs of travelers and gossip, had a hush after curfew when first sleep began. The science, if you want to call it that, supported this. Medieval physicians wrote that the body benefited from dividing its rest into 2 halves. They believed digestion, for example, was better handled if the first sleep gave the stomach a chance to settle food. Wakefulness in between allowed the body to redistribute humors, the 4 vital fluids that supposedly governed health: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you didn't allow the night to breathe between sleeps, they warned, your humors would knot together like sour wine in a cask. Silly as it sounds, people believed it, and it shaped their bedtime patterns. Here, where it gets quirky, the first sleep wasn't always spent in the bed alone. Families sometimes let the fire burn low but not completely out, so the room stayed dim but usable. In that twilight hush, some people slipped into lighter, almost meditative states instead of deep unconsciousness. Monks wrote that this early slumber was often accompanied by visions. Was it exhaustion, prayer, or just the brain trying to figure out what to do without tick-tock? Hard to say. But imagine falling asleep, not with the intent of staying under until dawn, but with the expectation of waking up halfway through the night, your body almost planning its dreams around the schedule. Dreams from this first sleep had their own reputation. Medieval dream books, little guides that claimed to interpret visions, treated early night dreams as trivial. They were said to be caused by supper, drink, or idle chatter before bed. One manual explained it like this: if you dreamed of chasing animals or wrestling strangers during your first sleep, it was just your dinner rebelling against your stomach. On the other hand, dreams during the second sleep were thought to come from deeper, truer places, sometimes even prophetic. So if you wanted a good mystical vision, the first sleep was just warm-up. The idea of sleep hygiene existed too, though it looked very different from your modern advice to avoid screens before bed. Medieval people were warned against eating too much pork or cheese at supper, since those foods were said to trouble the brain and cause restless first sleep. They were also told to avoid strong drink if they wanted peaceful dreams. That advice, at least, feels timeless. Some manuals even recommended washing your feet before bed to settle your humors. Try imagining that as the last step of your nightly routine, dunking your feet in cold water before curling up in your hay sack. There was also a physical practicality to the first sleep. Remember, most people's lives were brutally physical: farming, hauling, grinding grain, mending tools. Sleep came quickly not just from dim light but from sheer exhaustion. This was especially true in winter, when days were short and work was intense, like slaughtering livestock or preserving food for the cold months. People didn't have the luxury of lounging late into the night. The body demanded collapse. And yet the rhythm wasn't rigid. Nobles, for instance, might delay first sleep with banquets, music, or storytelling. A lord's hall glowed with torches and echoed with laughter long into the evening. Their first sleep began later, and sometimes it was shorter. Monks, by contrast, lived under strict schedules. In many monasteries, the bell rang at set hours through the night, forcing brothers to rise for prayer. For them, the idea of first sleep was tangled up with religious duty, more ritual than rest. Historians still argue whether this division of the night was universal or more common in certain classes or climates. Did peasants in southern Europe, where nights were shorter and warmer, really sleep in 2 shifts, or did they simply collapse from fatigue and wake with the sun? The records lean heavily on northern Europe and England, which leaves gaps. And yet, enough scattered references survive, letters, diaries, even court testimonies, to suggest it wasn't just a quirk of one region but a broad medieval pattern. The most striking part, though, is how natural it feels when you think about it. Without the hum of electric light, your body begins winding down not at 11 p.m. but shortly after sunset. Darkness stretches on, so of course you wouldn't sleep in a single block. It would feel like wasting time. Instead, you'd fall asleep early, wake up in the quiet middle hours, and then slip into the deeper second sleep before dawn. Back in that medieval chamber, you shift slightly on the mattress. The first sleep leaves you drowsy but not fully satisfied, like the appetizer before a feast. In the air hangs the scent of smoke and wool, and the hush of the household spreads over you. The candle has burned to a stub, its wax dribbled down onto the wooden table. The moon outside presses faint light through the cracks of the shutter. The first sleep is over, and the real magic of the night, the strange, wakeful middle, awaits. You open your eyes again, and this time it isn't because of a nightmare or some sudden noise in the street. No, your body expects this. The first sleep has ended and the waking hour has begun. This is the strangest part of the medieval night, the in-between stretch that modern people often stumble into by accident, 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling, wondering why they're awake. But in the Middle Ages, that wakefulness was no accident. It was planned. It was accepted. It was useful. You sit up and the world feels different. There is no rush, no sense of interruption. Your breath steams faintly in the cool air. The fire is little more than glowing embers now. The house around you is quiet, but not completely. A servant coughs in another corner. Someone in the street outside mutters while passing. A dog scratches itself against the door. The darkness doesn't feel empty, it feels alive. This is what they called the watch, a period of quiet wakefulness that stretched anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours, depending on who you were and what you had to do. You're not groggy. Strangely enough, you feel alert, as if the body has designed itself to handle this break. Your mind races with thoughts that weren't there before. It's as if a curtain has been pulled back and you're standing in some liminal space, halfway between sleep and day. What did people do with this waking hour? The answers are as varied as medieval life itself. Some people prayed. Others whispered with their spouses. Some went outside to tend to livestock or check the fire in the bakehouse. Still others simply lay in bed and thought, reflecting on dreams, on worries, or on plans for tomorrow's labor. In court records, there are even accounts of crimes and quarrels happening during these hours, proof that not all midnight activities were holy. One mainstream historical fact. Letters and diaries from the period mention this two-part sleep openly, as if it were obvious. A 17th century English doctor even advised patients to take advantage of the waking hour for quiet meditation or study, since the brain was supposedly at its sharpest then. For a world without electric light, it seems they discovered a natural rhythm we've mostly forgotten. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some physicians claim this waking period was the best time for conception, because the body had already rested once and the mind was calmer. That's right. Your medieval equivalent of late-night scrolling might have been a different sort of hobby entirely. Manuals actually advised couples to use the waking hour for intimacy, warning that exhaustion before first sleep made it less effective. You can imagine the hushed laughter, the whispered voices in the darkness, the creak of the straw bed. In a crowded household, that waking hour might be the only moment of semi-privacy. But not everything about the watch was playful or cozy. For many, it was practical. Farmers used it to stoke fires, repair small tools, or slip outside to check animals. Night was full of dangers, both real and imagined, and this alert interlude let people feel more secure. If thieves or raiders came, you were already half awake. If the wind caught the thatch roof and sparks flew, someone was ready to act. This brings us to superstition. The waking hour was considered a thin time, a moment when the veil between the earthly and the spiritual stretched thinner. People believed that ghosts wandered more freely in the middle of the night. Witches, too, were thought to prefer the hours after midnight, stealing into barns to curse cows or sour milk. If you were awake, you might whisper a quick prayer, clutch a rosary, or burn a sprig of sage to keep mischief away. And of course, there were those who claimed that your thoughts in the midnight watch could shape your fortune for the day ahead. Imagine lying awake, fretting about unpaid rents or a bad harvest, believing your very worries could make them come true. Historians still argue whether this waking hour was entirely voluntary or more forced by environment. Was it really biology nudging people awake after 4 hours? Or was it the drafty cold, the flicker of the dying fire, or even the noise of a busy medieval town that interrupted slumber? Experiments with extended darkness suggest our bodies do naturally fall into segmented sleep, but some scholars argue that people may have leaned into the habit because the conditions made it inevitable. It's one of those debates where the lines between natural and cultural blur. Imagine it for yourself. You rise from bed and move quietly across the room. The floor creaks beneath your bare feet. You stir the fire until the embers flare a little brighter, warming your hands. The smell of wood smoke drifts up. Maybe you light a small rushlight, a cheap candle made by dipping reeds in animal fat. It gives just enough glow for you to see your way. You pour a cup of watered ale, take a sip, and sit back down. This is no anxious insomnia. It's purposeful. Your neighbors might be awake too. If you live in a crowded town, you might even hear the muffled voices of others, murmuring through thin walls. A guard walks the streets, his lantern bobbing. Sometimes people visited one another during these hours, especially in villages. Knocking on a door at midnight wasn't as strange then as it would be now. After all, the day was only halfway through, and you had time before the second sleep. The watch was also a time for stories. Families might whisper tales to children, or adults might share gossip in hushed tones. Without the distractions of work or daylight, the night watch became oddly intimate. It was, in many ways, the true social heart of the day, though most of us today sleep right through it. Think about your own nights, those moments when you wake up at 3 a.m. and find your thoughts unusually sharp, sometimes too sharp. You worry about things you never bother with in daylight, or you imagine solutions to problems you dismissed earlier. That's exactly what the medieval watch was like, only they accepted it instead of fighting it. No melatonin, no blackout curtains, just a recognition that wakefulness had its place. And when the hour finally passed, when the mind had wandered and the embers glowed low again, people would lie back down and let the second sleep claim them. This was the deeper, more restorative rest, and it would carry them to dawn. But that part of the night, the quiet watch, was the hinge, the pause in the middle of the symphony of darkness. So here you are, awake in the middle of the medieval night, and it doesn't feel wrong. It feels right. The silence hums with possibility. You sip your ale, whisper a prayer, glance at the shuttered window. The town breathes quietly outside. Soon enough, sleep will return. But for now, you linger in this strange, forgotten interval, alert, calm, and utterly medieval. The midnight waking lingers, and you find yourself caught in the in-between. Not fully awake like you would be in the brightness of noon, but not drowsy enough to sink back into the straw mattress either. The air carries a peculiar stillness, as if the whole world has agreed to pause for a secret intermission. In this quiet, your mind turns naturally to things deeper, stranger, and sometimes darker than the chatter of daylight. For medieval people, this was the hour of prayers, dreams, and whispered fears. You sit upright, the wool blanket gathered around your shoulders. The embers in the hearth glow faintly, and the rushlight burns with a crooked, flickering flame. Around you, the children still sleep in tangled heaps, their breaths soft and uneven. The world outside is muffled. The dog by the door shifts in size. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls the hour, hollow and heavy, marking midnight or a little after. This toll was more than just sound. It was an anchor, reminding every listener that time still flowed, even in darkness. For many, this waking interval became a natural time to pray. Imagine kneeling on the hard-packed earth or wooden floor, muttering the Pater Noster or the Ave Maria in a whisper so soft it barely disturbs the silence. In a world where danger lurked in every shadow, wolves, fire, thieves, sickness, you'd want every ounce of divine protection. Monks, of course, took this further. Their entire lives were structured around the rhythm of hours, and they rose deliberately at midnight to chant matins, filling stone cloisters with echoing voices. Ordinary layfolk didn't have such discipline, but they still knew the middle of the night was fertile ground for prayer. The belief was simple. Your soul was most open to God when your body was weary and the world outside lay hushed. A mainstream historical fact here. Prayer manuals from the late Middle Ages often included special nighttime prayers, suggesting that ordinary people were expected to use these waking moments for devotion. Some of these prayers asked for protection against demons and nightmares, while others simply thanked God for the rest already received and requested strength for the hours yet to come. In a sense, the night was a kind of miniature life cycle. You began, you paused, and you ended at dawn. But prayer wasn't the only occupation. This was also the hour of dreams. Waking between first and second sleep meant you carried fragments of your earlier visions into consciousness. You might lie awake, sifting through what you just dreamed. A meadow, a storm, a conversation with someone long dead. Was it only supper weighing on your stomach, or was it a message? Medieval people took this question very seriously. Dreams were thought to be a communication channel, sometimes from God, sometimes from the devil, and sometimes from the body itself. The trick was figuring out which. Quirky tidbit: entire dream dictionaries circulated in the Middle Ages promising to decode your visions. Dream of teeth falling out. That meant illness or even death in the family. Dream of water overflowing its banks. That pointed to gossip or betrayal. Dream of flying, a sign of pride, possibly sinful. Imagine lying in your medieval bed at 1 a.m. poking your spouse awake just to whisper, "I dreamed of a crow. Should I be worried?" Then both of you lying there, debating whether it was a bad omen or just indigestion from that heavy barley stew. Dreams also fed into fears. Nightmares were sometimes called night hags or marides, evil spirits that pressed down on your chest as you slept. If you woke breathless or sweating, you might assume you'd just been visited by one. In some villages, people even placed iron knives or religious charms beneath their pillows to ward them off. That's right. The medieval version of a sleep mask was a dagger under your straw mattress. Comforting. Historians still argue whether these beliefs about dreams were universal or more common in certain classes. Literate nobles and monks left written records about interpreting visions, but peasants, whose voices we mostly lack, may have had their own oral traditions, just as rich but now lost. Did they believe dreams came from God, or did they shrug them off as nonsense? We can only guess, though hints in folklore suggest peasants were often the most superstitious of all. Beyond prayer and dreams, there were whispered fears, the kind that only surface in the fragile hours after midnight. You know the feeling. Lying awake, your mind invents worries out of nothing. Medieval people had plenty to worry about. What if the crops failed this year? What if the baby coughed himself into sickness by morning? What if the Lord raised taxes again, or worse, demanded a levy of men for war? With no distractions, no glowing phone, no background hum of a fridge, the mind latched onto its anxieties. Some called this the devil's whisper, a way of explaining why negative thoughts came more strongly in the middle of the night. Others saw it as the soul doing honest work, sorting through its burdens when everything else was silent. In households with multiple sleepers crammed into the same bed, whispered conversations often began during this waking stretch. A husband might murmur to his wife about tomorrow's work. Parents might hush their children back to sleep. Servants, lying in pallets nearby, might listen or even join in. Privacy didn't exist, so nighttime talk was cautious, soft, almost conspiratorial. Imagine being a child and hearing your parents' hushed voices while you pretended to sleep, their worries leaking into the dark. That was the education of the night. Sometimes, the whispered fears went further into superstition. What if the knock you heard outside wasn't a neighbor but a wandering soul? What if the flicker of the candle flame meant a death was coming soon? People told stories of will-o'-the-wisps luring travelers to their doom, or the wild hunt, ghostly riders sweeping across the skis in the dead of night. Being awake in these hours didn't just open your mind to your own thoughts, it exposed you to the folklore around you. No wonder prayers were so popular then. Fear begged for protection. And yet not all midnight waking was grim. For some, it was peaceful. Without the rush of the day or the obligations of labor, the hour became a rare gift of solitude. Imagine lying back, staring at the dark rafters above and simply breathing. For peasants who worked from dawn till dusk, or mothers who never found a moment's silence during daylight, this was a kind of stolen freedom. Even fear, in its way, sharpened the sense of being alive. As the waking hour stretches on, you feel your eyelids grow heavy again. The prayers are whispered, the fears confronted, the dreams remembered. Slowly, you sink back into your straw mattress, letting the wool blanket cocoon you once more. Outside, the world remains dark, but inside, your mind begins to loosen its grip. The second sleep is waiting, deeper and stranger than the first. The second sleep hasn't quite claimed you yet, and your mind drifts toward the simple fact that not every medieval night looked the same. You've been imagining yourself in a modest merchant's chamber or a peasant's cottage, but across the social spectrum, whether you were tilling fields, managing a manor, or chanting in a monastery. The rhythm of two sleeps adapted to your station in life. Farmers, nobles, and monks all shared the basic outline, but the details were wildly different. Let's start with the farmer because honestly, the medieval economy rested on their sore, calloused shoulders. You wake before dawn most days, but tonight you're still in the middle stretch, caught between first and second sleep. You've already worked a full day, plowing, sowing, harvesting, mending tools, herding livestock, repairing fences. Your back aches, your hands are raw, and your supper, likely some dark bread, a bit of pottage, and maybe an onion or two, sits heavy in your stomach. First sleep for you comes quickly, almost brutally. You collapse onto the straw-stuffed mattress like a sack of grain, surrounded by your family, sometimes even by animals that share the warmth of the cottage. Your waking hour is practical. You don't waste candles unless you have to, so your activity is usually limited to what can be done by firelight, mending harnesses, sharpening a blade, or whispering plans for the next day's chores. If a cow moos outside or a chicken rustles in the coop, you slip out to check, because livestock meant survival. Farmers knew this waking period wasn't an inconvenience, it was an opportunity. Without it, the work would spill into precious daylight hours. In a way, the rhythm of two sleeps was woven into the very fabric of survival. Now shift your perspective. You're a noble in a manor house, sleeping in a chamber lined with tapestries. Your bed is not straw, but a feather mattress piled with blankets and furs. First sleep comes later for you because your evenings stretch long into the night. Feasts, music, storytelling, and political discussions fill the hall below. You've eaten far more than bread and onions. Your supper has included roasted meat, fine wine, spiced dishes brought by traders. By the time you retire to your chamber, your stomach is heavy, and your dreams are more likely to be influenced by excess than hunger. When you stir in the waking hour, your activities differ from the farmer. You might light more candles because you can afford them. You might talk privately with your spouse about alliances, dowries, or land disputes. Some nobles even kept books, so the midnight hour might be used for reading or dictating letters. A few wrote of using this time for prayer, but just as often it was used for intimacy. After all, the household staff was asleep, and you finally had privacy. For nobles, the night was not simply about survival. It was also about strategy, about maintaining status, about shaping the future of their estates. And then there are the monks. If the farmers' and nobles' lives revolved around survival and status, the monk revolved around eternity. Their nights were governed by bells and the strict rules of the monastery. First sleep for a monk might last only a few hours before the bell tolled for matins, the midnight office. In the darkness of a stone chapel, with candles sputtering against damp walls, monks gathered to chant psalms and read scripture. This wasn't a stolen moment of wakefulness. It was mandated. The idea was that by sacrificing comfort and embracing discipline, monks aligned themselves with the divine order. One mainstream historical fact here. The rule of Saint Benedict, which shaped monastic life across Europe, prescribed this nighttime rising as central to spiritual practice. Sleep was never meant to be continuous for a monk. Broken rest mirrored the constant vigilance expected of the soul. While layfolk returned to their second sleep after prayers, monks often stayed up longer, using the hours for study or manual labor before resting again briefly. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some monasteries, novices were warned that demons prowled most fiercely during the waking hours. If a monk fell asleep during prayers, it wasn't just laziness. It was a sign the devil was tugging at his soul. To combat this, monasteries developed bizarre methods of staying alert. Cold water splashed on the face, fasting, or even sleeping in uncomfortable positions so the body wouldn't sink too deeply. Imagine trying to nod off with your head propped on a wooden block because you feared Satan might sneak in during your nap. For peasants, nobles, and monks alike, the waking hour shaped identity. Farmers used it to secure survival. Nobles used it to strategize and connect privately. Monks used it to discipline the spirit. The two-sleep pattern wasn't just biological, it was cultural, a rhythm adapted to circumstance. Historians still argue whether this segmentation was universal across Europe. Some claim that southern regions with shorter nights, might have skipped the long waking interval. Others point out that seasonal variations meant the habit looked different in winter versus summer. But across the sources, court records, diaries, religious texts, the evidence shows a common thread. Nobody thought continuous sleep was normal. The idea of one long, unbroken slumber is the modern invention, not theirs. Imagine moving between these lives for a night. As a farmer, your waking hour is filled with the crackle of the hearth and the smell of animals outside. As a noble, it's hushed whispers in a candlelit chamber, tapestries blocking the draft. As a monk, it's the haunting sound of chants echoing against cold stone walls. All of you, peasants, lords, and men of God, share the same rhythm of two sleeps, but each experiences it through a lens colored by duty and class. And here's the part that ties it together. Despite the differences, everyone belonged to the same cycle of darkness. Whether you were worrying about your crops, your land holdings, or your soul, you woke in the middle of the night and confronted yourself in the quiet. No matter how high your station, no matter how rough your bed, you were united by the strange pulse of medieval time. So as the night stretches on, you tuck yourself back beneath your blanket, your mind drifting from farmer's toil to noble schemes to monk's chants. The second sleep is calling, but before you surrender, you understand something. The night in medieval Europe wasn't a blank void. It was alive with class, with duty, with meaning. And whether you lived in a thatched cottage, a stone monastery, or a fortified manor, the two sleeps shaped you all the same. You're drifting between dreams, still caught in the seam of night, when a sound pulls you back. A faint clatter, the creak of a door, maybe the scrape of a pot. It reminds you that in medieval households, sleep was rarely universal. Even when most bodies collapsed into straw and feather, at least one person was always awake, busy with work, duty, or watchfulness. The truth is, a medieval household never fully slept. Picture the peasant's cottage first. It's a single room, low-ceilinged, with smoke from the hearth curling stubbornly into your nostrils because chimneys aren't a given yet. You and your family share the floor, packed together for warmth, bodies lined up like spoons in a drawer. A dog nestles near your feet and maybe a chicken or two perches in the rafters. First sleep overtakes everyone easily, but during that middle waking stretch, the rhythm staggers. The father might rise to check the animals, because a fox prowling the henhouse could mean losing a meal. A mother might tend to a crying infant or stir the embers to keep the room from freezing. Even children might wake, rolling over, complaining of the cold. And here's the thing, the cottage itself seems alive. The fire must be coaxed, the animals managed, the tools mended. The work doesn't pause just because your eyelids want to. Think of the mother poking at the ashes until sparks glow red again, then blowing carefully until flames catch. That's your heating system, your cooking range, your light source, and your insurance against spirits who, so people believed, were less likely to creep into a home guarded by fire. Quirky tidbit. Some families even left out bread or milk during the night as offerings for household sprites. Better to appease them than risk mischief while you slept. Shift the scene to a castle or manor. Surely the rich had uninterrupted sleep, right? Not so fast. Nobles may have had feather beds, curtains, and servants, but households this large needed structure around the clock. Guards patrolled walls. A steward might check supplies. In the kitchens, bread had to be prepared at odd hours so it would be ready by dawn. And the noble family itself, they might wake in that in-between stretch for personal matters. Maybe the lord spoke with his wife about land disputes, or maybe he snuck down the corridor to see a mistress. Castles weren't only about politics. The halls might seem silent, but if you listen, you'll hear boots echoing faintly on stone, or the rattle of keys from servants slipping between chambers. This leads to another mainstream fact. Castles employed night watchmen precisely because night was considered dangerous. Fire, theft, even rebellion could erupt under cover of darkness, and there was always the fear of outside attack. Think about it. While you sleep, who guards the gate? The answer is some weary soldier stomping his feet against the cold, trying not to drift off. The household's peace depended on someone else's sleeplessness. Monasteries again had their own strange rhythm. You think the brothers snoozed peacefully after chanting their midnight prayers. Not quite. Someone had to keep lamps burning in the chapel, another tended livestock, and in some houses, monks rotated duties so that someone always prayed, no matter the hour. This was called perpetual prayer, a spiritual relay race against sin and chaos. Even when you shut your eyes, the chant continued somewhere in the stone labyrinth of the cloister. Historians still argue whether households were ever completely quiet. Some scholars say there must have been stretches of deep stillness, broken only by snores or rustling straw. Others believe the constant cycle of duties, animals, and anxieties meant true silence was rare. What's certain is that medieval people did not expect their homes to be sanctuaries of 8 solid hours. A house was more like a ship at sea. Someone always had the night watch. Let's make it tangible. Imagine lying on your straw mattress and hearing your neighbor cough, then the shuffle of her skirts as she kneels to pray. A few moments later, you catch the scrape of a knife as your father sharpens it near the fire. Outside, a dog barks, short, sharp warning of movement. You don't need to get up, but you know someone will. Maybe your older brother trudges out, lantern in hand, muttering about foxes. Inside, the air still smells of smoke and sweat, and your little sister stirs, mumbling nonsense in her sleep. In that moment, you realize, night in a medieval home isn't a single lullaby. It's a chorus, voices rising and falling, overlapping, weaving a pattern of rest and vigilance. And what about towns? In a medieval city, the household extends beyond walls. Curfews were common. Bells rang to signal when fires should be doused and when taverns must close. But did everyone obey? Of course not. Bakers lit their ovens well before dawn, night watchmen patrolled streets with rattles to scare off thieves, and drunks stumbled home from alehouses long after curfew. Your house might settle into darkness, but outside, the city hummed faintly. Someone was always awake somewhere. Here, another odd detail. In larger households, particularly noble ones, servants often slept in doorways or at the foot of beds. Not for comfort, but for duty. They acted as human alarms meant to wake instantly if needed. If their master stirred in the waking hour, they had to be ready, fetching wine, relaying messages, or escorting them down the hall. Imagine being half asleep on the floor, only to be kicked awake because your lord suddenly wanted to check the accounts at 2 a.m. That's not exactly restful. And the animals, oh, the animals. Chickens, pigs, and goats often lived in or near peasant homes. Their sounds punctuated the night. A pig might grunt, a rooster might crow early, confused by the moonlight. Dogs barked at wolves or strangers. Horses stamped in stables. In some sense, the entire household, human and animal, took turns waking and dozing. You might even call it a living ecosystem of broken sleep. So when you think of medieval sleep, erase the picture of a house sunk in silence. Think instead of layers. First, sleep blanketed most of the household, but the waking hour peeled it back. People moved, fires were tended, prayers whispered, tools repaired, watchmen paced. Then second sleep returned like another wave, covering everyone again until dawn. And here's the irony. Many of us today fight insomnia as though it's a flaw, a betrayal of our bodies. But for medieval people, waking in the night was normal, expected, even productive. The household adapted because life demanded it. Nobody thought, why can't I just sleep through? They thought, good, now I can check the fire or mend the harness or whisper to God. Their world was never fully asleep, and in a way that made it safer. Someone was always awake to guard, to work, to pray. So you turn over on your rough straw pallet, listening to the quiet bustle of your medieval household, the scrape of a pot, the sigh of your mother by the fire, the creak of boots outside. It isn't silence, but it is security. And as the second sleep begins to creep back over you, you realize a medieval night was never a pause button. It was a shared rhythm, a communal duty, and a reminder that even in rest, life never fully stopped. The embers in the hearth have dimmed to a faint orange glow. Shadows stretch long and strange across the floor, and you are suddenly aware of how loud your own breathing sounds in the silence. The household has mostly slipped back into second sleep, but your mind, restless as ever, refuses to surrender. And as you lie there in the dark, you remember. In the medieval world, night was never just night. It was a stage for fear, a playground for demons, witches, and things that lurked where light did not reach. We, with our street lamps and motion sensors, forget how absolute darkness once was. Medieval nights weren't sprinkled with the neon glow of cities, the hum of traffic, or the lazy glow of your smartphone screen. Once the sun dipped, darkness was heavy, tangible, almost alive. That's the backdrop against which your first and second sleeps unfolded. And in the dark, your imagination, or maybe something more, ran wild. People genuinely believed that demons prowled during the waking hour. You stir in your bed, half-conscious, and a thought flickers. Is that just the wind scratching at the shutters or claws testing the wood? The medieval mind didn't shrug this off. It explained such sounds through theology and folklore. Witches were said to ride at night, slipping through keyholes or even cracks in the walls to torment sleepers. Succubi and incubi, those infamous night demons, were believed to press down on your chest, smothering you, sometimes even stealing your seed or life force. Today we might call it sleep paralysis. Back then, it was a demon paying a midnight visit. Here's your mainstream historical fact. One of the most common prayers recommended in manuals for layfolk was the Ave Maria, or the Lord's Prayer, specifically recited before bed as protection against nighttime spirits. Parish priests routinely reminded congregants that sleep left them vulnerable to spiritual attack. People didn't take chances. Amulets, charms, and the sign of the cross became nightly rituals as important as washing your face. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some believed demons couldn't cross a threshold sprinkled with salt, or that iron objects, scissors, knives, even nails, placed under the bed or pillow could ward them off. Imagine sleeping with a pair of shears tucked uncomfortably beneath your straw mattress because your grandmother swore it would keep the devil out of your dreams. Your waking hour, then, wasn't always a calm time for prayer or quiet tasks. For some, it was a battle against fear. A creak in the beams overhead might send you muttering charms. A sudden gust through the shutter could feel like an invisible hand brushing against your skin. If you dared to step outside, the landscape transformed. Trees loomed like giants, their branches clawing the sky. The path to the well seemed endless. Even a harmless cow shifting in the pasture could jolt your heart, its shape unfamiliar and monstrous in moonlight. Now think of the city streets after curfew. They were locked down not only to prevent crime but to contain fear itself. Authorities rang curfew bells, ordered fires doused, and barred taverns partly because they knew idle wandering bred danger, and also superstition. A drunken brawl at midnight was bad enough, but what if people began whispering that demons had guided their hands? Better to enforce silence, let the waking hour stay indoors, confined to prayers and whispers by the hearth. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly believed these fears, or whether they served as convenient stories to explain illness, accidents, or simply bad dreams. Was the succubus a literal demon, or a way to understand desire and shame? Was the midnight scratching mouse turned into a witch's familiar because people needed an explanation for every sound? The sources leave room for interpretation. Some sermons thunder with conviction, while others betray a sly wink, as if the priest himself half knew the line between belief and folklore was blurry. But in the moment, lying awake in a creaky cottage or a drafty castle, fear was visceral. Darkness had weight. Sleep was divided, and in the gap the mind wandered. Maybe you were one of the lucky ones, reaching for a prayer and drifting back peacefully into second sleep. Or maybe your chest grew heavy, your breath shallow, and you were convinced, utterly, that something unseen crouched just beyond your reach. There's another layer too, the idea of sin. Priests warned that night demons preyed hardest on those burdened with guilt. If you cheated your neighbor, stolen bread, or whispered lustful thoughts, your chances of a nocturnal visit grew higher. The waking hour wasn't just about survival, it was about conscience. You tossed and turned, replaying sins in your mind, wondering if tonight was the night you'd be punished. Even animals became omens. Owls hooted in the dark and people whispered they were witches in disguise. Dogs howled, and it was said they sensed spirits the human eye could not see. Cats slinking silently through alleys were not just vermin catchers. They were familiars, pawns of the devil. So imagine hearing that eerie mew outside your shutter at midnight. Would you think just a stray? No, you'd cross yourself and whisper a prayer, hoping it moved along. And yet, despite all this fear, the night also held a strange intimacy. Families huddled closer, fires crackled louder, and prayers were spoken more earnestly. In a way, fear bound communities. You and your neighbors all agreed that witches flew, demons pressed, and spirits prowled. That shared belief meant shared rituals, blessing beds, hanging charms, lighting candles. The night was terrifying, yes, but it was also strangely communal. So you roll over, tugging your blanket tighter, trying to ignore the sigh of the wind outside, the creak of the beams, the faint scratching that might just be a mouse, or might not. Your heart slows, your breathing steadies, and finally the grip of second sleep begins to pull you under. But even as your eyelids grow heavy, you know one thing: medieval nights were never empty. They were charged with fear, populated by demons, and thick with whispers of danger. The dark was not just absence of light, it was a presence of something else. Your body has finally surrendered to second sleep, but your mind drifts into a strange landscape, part memory, part fantasy, part divine revelation. Dreams in the medieval imagination were not just harmless flickers of the brain. They were portals, warnings, even messages from God or the devil. And in this odd world where nights were broken into two halves, dreams took on a layered importance, woven tightly into the rhythm of first and second sleep. Think of yourself lying on that straw mattress or feather bed, heart still echoing with the fears of demons from your waking hour. As you fall deeper, the second sleep pulls you into a dream. Suddenly, you're standing in a meadow under a silver moon, but the grass whispers as though it speaks. A figure in robes beckons you, pointing to a mountain in the distance. When you wake, sweating, you don't shrug it off with weird dream. No, this is a sign. You might run to your priest, asking what mountain, what message. Or maybe you whisper to your neighbor that you've seen an omen. Dreams mattered, and they mattered deeply. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval scholars divided dreams into categories. Following thinkers like Macrobius and later Thomas Aquinas, dreams could be somnia, true visions, prophetic messages, or mere insomnia, confused imaginings caused by indigestion or poor sleep. The Church walked a fine line, sometimes declaring dreams as divine messages, sometimes condemning them as devilish temptations. Your midnight visions weren't just your business. They could become a matter of spiritual importance. And here's a quirky tidbit. People believed certain foods before bed could influence dreams. Too much cheese, for instance, was said to conjure strange or even lustful visions. A heavy stew might weigh on your stomach and produce nightmares. So if you were a peasant who stuffed yourself with leftover curds, don't be surprised when you dreamt of witches riding goats or saints holding flaming swords. In some folk practices, people even ate specific herbs to encourage visions. Wormwood, for example, was thought to open the mind to prophecy. Imagine dousing yourself with bitter herbs before bed, hoping your dream would reveal whether the harvest would succeed. Now think of the waking hour in the middle of the night. You've just risen from first sleep, and your dreams from those first few hours are fresh. Families often shared them aloud, whispering by the fire. "I dreamt the river overflowed," someone might say, and the others would murmur that it meant a flood was coming, or that God was displeased. Dreams weren't brushed off as nonsense. They were conversation topics, warnings, even community decisions. If 3 people in your household dreamt of wolves, you'd likely take it seriously and watch the flock more carefully the next day. Historians still argue whether medieval dream interpretation was more influenced by pagan traditions, biblical precedent, or medical theory. Some say peasants clung to older, folkloric methods of reading dreams, seeing foxes as signs of betrayal, birds as messengers. Others emphasize the church's role, pointing to priests and monks who cataloged dream types. And then there's the medical view. The balance of humors, they said, shaped what you dreamed. Too much black bile and you'd see frightening images. Too much phlegm and your dreams would be sluggish and slow. The truth is, all these explanations overlapped. You might interpret one dream through scripture, another through humors, another through folk superstition, all in the same household. Consider the noble family again. Their chamber is lined with tapestries, but even in comfort, dreams were powerful. A noblewoman might dream of a falcon swooping down, and the household priest would interpret it as a sign her son would rise to greatness or fall to ruin. Kings themselves often claimed prophetic dreams. Chroniclers recorded them with solemnity, as if the fate of realms hinged on the slumbering mind. A dream of a bleeding crown or a burning church could send ripples through an entire court. Monks, too, saw dreams as battlegrounds. Many believed demons whispered temptations into your mind as you slept. A dream of lust wasn't just indigestion, it was evidence the devil had infiltrated your soul. This kept monks locked in cycles of guilt, confession, and penance. Yet other monks wrote about dreams as windows to the divine, visions of saints, angels, or Christ himself. The line was thin, the stakes high. To claim a divine dream was bold, unless it proved true, in which case it could elevate the dreamer's reputation to near sainthood. Now picture the peasant again. He has dreamt of his deceased father standing silently at the end of the bed. To us, that might sound like grief bubbling up. To him, it's far more serious. The dead were thought to walk most easily at night, slipping into dreams with warnings or demands. Maybe the father asks for prayers to ease his soul through purgatory. Maybe he warns of an illness in the village. The dreamer wakes troubled, convinced he's been visited, and shares it during the waking hour. The family takes it seriously, saying extra prayers or even commissioning a candle to burn for the dead. And here's something both fascinating and eerie. The two-sleep system may have given medieval people more opportunity to remember and reflect on dreams. After first sleep, they woke naturally, often talking quietly, sometimes even writing. That meant the first batch of dreams wasn't lost to the morning blur. It was captured, mulled over, even dissected while still fresh. How many of our own dreams vanish because we sleep straight through? Medieval people had a built-in mechanism for recall. Their dream world was alive, continuous part of daily life. So as you curl back into second sleep, visions resume. Maybe you dream of fields of wheat glowing unnaturally golden, or of a dark river filled with whispering voices. In the medieval world, you would wake with a sense of awe or dread, searching for meaning, never dismissing it as random. Dreams were not background noise. They were the midnight theater of the soul, and every symbol carried weight. By dawn, the dreams of first and second sleep might braid together, shaping the stories you told at breakfast, the choices you made in the field, even the prayers you whispered at Mass. In a way, your medieval life wasn't just guided by daylight and duty. It was steered by the landscapes of sleep, those visions that crept in when the world was dark and still. You stir in your bed, your belly heavy from yesterday's bread and pottage, and you can almost feel the weight of your body shifting uneasily. In medieval thought, that discomfort wasn't just too much stew before bed. No, it was the movement of your humors, those mysterious bodily fluids believed to govern health, personality, and even sleep. If dreams were windows to the soul, humors were the gears and pulleys of the machine. And the night, especially the divided night of first and second sleep, was their playground. The theory of humors wasn't some fringe quackery. It was the mainstream science of the day. Rooted in the writings of Hippocrates and Galen, refined by Arabic scholars and endlessly repeated in medieval universities, the idea was simple in concept yet all-encompassing in practice. Your body was made of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much or too little of any one and you fell ill, or grew moody, or dreamed strangely, or couldn't sleep at all. Doctors, priests, and even common folk framed nightly experiences through this lens. Imagine lying awake after first sleep. You roll over, restless, and your wife whispers, "It's the phlegm, too much fish stew tonight." Or your neighbor mutters the next morning that his nightmare came from an excess of black bile. These weren't jokes. They were serious diagnoses, the way we talk about blood pressure or calories today. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Medical texts of the Middle Ages, like those derived from Galen or later translated by scholars in Salerno, explicitly linked sleep to humors. Blood made you sanguine, prone to cheerfulness and vivid dreams. Phlegm made you sluggish, sleepy, and prone to heavy, damp dreams. Yellow bile produced restless, fiery sleep full of violent images. Black bile dragged you into gloomy, disturbing nightmares. The balance of these humors was thought to rise and fall with the night. And now for the quirky tidbit. Doctors often prescribed unusual bedtime rituals to balance humors before sleep. One recommendation: don't eat lettuce if you want to avoid too much melancholy. It supposedly increased black bile. Another: sleep on your right side first, so food digested more quickly, then turn to your left side later to let vapors rise to the brain. Imagine tucking yourself in, not just for comfort, but with the solemn purpose of correct digestion. Some even suggested gently tickling your feet before bed to stir blood flow and counteract sluggish phlegm. Yes, tickle therapy, medieval style. The broken night of first and second sleep actually made sense in this framework. After supper, digestion was heavy, humors were stirred, and your first sleep was when the body processed it all. You woke in the middle because vapors, yes, literal vapors from your stomach rose to the brain, triggering dreams and restlessness. The waking hour allowed those vapors to dissipate before you returned to your second, lighter sleep, hopefully clearer and calmer. To a medieval physician, segmented sleep wasn't a mystery. It was practically proof of humoral theory at work. But not everyone agreed. Historians still argue whether common folk truly bought into the technical details of humors, or whether they leaned more on folk cures and superstition. Did the peasant sharpening his scythe at midnight think about black bile, or just blame the cheese for a nightmare? Evidence suggests a mix. Learned physicians in towns and universities pushed humoral explanations, while villagers layered those onto older traditions of charms and prayers. Still, the language of humors was everywhere. Sermons, medical manuals, even household advice. It bled into culture like background noise. Picture the noble household again. The Lord wakes after first sleep, complaining of a burning throat. His physician is summoned, a man in a fur-lined robe with a pouch of herbs. The diagnosis: an excess of yellow bile caused by too much roasted meat at supper. The remedy: a draught of watered wine mixed with cooling herbs like borage or violet. Maybe even a controlled bloodletting scheduled for tomorrow morning. To us, it sounds absurd. To him, it was cutting-edge medicine. Monks, too, leaned into humoral theory, but with a spiritual twist. A restless night wasn't just bad digestion, it was a temptation. Too much black bile, they said, made you melancholic and vulnerable to despair, the noonday demon that haunted monasteries. Too much phlegm lulled you into sloth, making you oversleep and miss prayers. The humors weren't just fluids, they were battlegrounds for the soul. Balance them, and you were both healthy and holy. Even architecture and routine reflected humoral beliefs. Bedrooms were advised to face east for freshness, not west where damp winds stirred phlegmatic imbalance. Warm, dry bedding was prized for balancing the body's cold humors during long winters. Candles made of beeswax were believed to burn cleaner than tallow, avoiding unhealthy fumes that might disturb sleep. Every choice, diet, bedding, light, posture, could be framed in terms of humors. And yet, for all their certainty, medieval people admitted confusion. Why did some dreams seem prophetic while others were nonsense? Why did some people thrive on short sleep while others languished? Physicians debated fiercely. Some argued that first sleep was when digestion produced chaotic dreams, while second sleep brought clarity and prophetic visions. Others said the opposite. Second sleep was muddled because digestion was nearly complete, producing toxins. Scholars wrote long treatises, but the peasant didn't care. He just wanted a good night's rest. Think, too, of how gender and age were folded into this. Women were thought naturally colder and wetter in humoral balance, prone to phlegm and melancholy. That meant their dreams and sleep patterns were read differently. Children, being moist in humoral language, supposedly dreamed more vividly and slept more heavily. The elderly, dry by nature, were restless, easily woken, plagued by fragmented sleep. Does that sound familiar? Maybe our modern experiences aren't so different, just explained with different metaphors. Now place yourself back in that waking hour. You've roused after first sleep, poked the fire, and sat down on a stool. Your stomach still feels heavy, so you mutter about phlegm. Your wife offers you a sip of herbal tisane, mint, maybe, or chamomile. You talk quietly about the strange dream you had, a river turning red, and she wonders aloud whether it was blood, humor overflowing. You both cross yourselves, whisper a prayer, and slip back into second sleep. The humors, balanced or not, have shaped not only your health but your understanding of the night itself. The genius or absurdity of the humoral worldview was that it left nothing unexplained. Nightmares, too much black bile, restlessness, heat of yellow bile, oversleeping, lazy phlegm, cheerful dreams of dancing, abundance of blood. It was neat, tidy, and reassuring. Maybe wrong by our standards, but deeply comforting in a world where darkness teemed with uncertainty. So as you let yourself drift deeper into second sleep, you feel those ancient fluids swirling, balancing, dictating your fate. You don't curse insomnia, you diagnose it. You don't ignore a dream, you interpret it. Your night, divided into two halves, is also a laboratory of humors, a nightly experiment in balance. And as dawn approaches with its first rooster's crow, you know your body has spent the hours negotiating with itself, guided by a science older than memory. Winter presses down on you like a heavy quilt, and in the medieval world you'd have felt it even more sharply. Nights stretched on endlessly, hours of darkness swallowing up the village, the castle, and the monastery alike. In summer you might manage to rise with the cock's crow after a mere 7 or 8 hours of broken slumber, but in winter the night could last 16 hours or more. That meant long evenings, long silences, and yes, plenty of time for a first and second sleep. If segmented sleep was ever logical, it was most logical in the dead of winter. Imagine yourself trudging across a frosty courtyard, your breath puffing clouds into the dark. The sky isn't just dark, it's absolute pitch black, a velvet dome pricked with stars. Candles and torches are expensive luxuries. Most villagers simply surrender to the night. Inside your hut, the hearth smolders low, and you and your family crawl under layers of wool and straw-stuffed mattresses as early as 5 or 6 in the evening. Sleep comes quick, your body aching from labor, the air cold enough to numb your toes. That's your first sleep. By midnight, though, you're awake again, blinking at the dying fire. The long hours of night demand it. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval people measured winter nights with a precision born of necessity. Monks, in particular, lived by canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, each tied to prayer. In December, matins could fall at 2 in the morning, meaning monks expected to wake in the gap between first and second sleep anyway. Their entire schedule was a lived example of segmented slumber. Records from Northern Europe even show adjustments to bell-ringing times as the days shortened and lengthened, suggesting that communities moved in harmony with the night's stretch and contraction. Now here's your quirky tidbit. In some villages, long winter nights birthed a peculiar form of socializing. After first sleep, neighbors would sometimes slip from their beds and gather around the communal fire or in one another's cottages. They'd share stories, mend tools, whisper gossip, or even practice folk magic, activities hidden from daylight scrutiny. Anthropologists call this the watch, an in-between culture of semi-sleep. Picture it, you wake around midnight, pad barefoot to your neighbor's hut, and spend 2 hours swapping tailies before returning home for second sleep. Who knew insomnia could be so communal? And here, where the scholarly debate comes in, historians still argue whether winter's long nights were experienced as oppressive or restful. Was segmented sleep a coping mechanism for unbearable darkness, or was it embraced as a rhythm that allowed for more prayer, reflection, and intimacy? Some scholars argue peasants dreaded the endless black, fearing demons, wolves, and thieves. Others propose they saw it as fertile time, a gift for dream interpretation, lovemaking, or planning tomorrow's chores. The truth probably varied depending on class, Geography and faith. Think of how the elite managed it. In castles with roaring fires and thick curtains, long nights became occasions for feasts, storytelling, or clandestine councils. A nobleman might spend the waking interval between sleeps plotting alliances or indulging in romances. Meanwhile, in monasteries, monks used those hours for silent contemplation or illuminated manuscripts, hunched over parchment with only a flickering candle. The difference between peasant and monk was stark. One used the break to stoke embers, the other to stoke his soul. But whether rich or poor, winter nights left their mark on the body. Modern science shows circadian rhythms respond to daylight exposure, and medieval people had no electric bulbs to override nature. When the sun set before supper and didn't rise until breakfast, their bodies naturally stretched sleep into two halves. First sleep might last 5 hours, then a 2-hour waking, then another 4 or 5 hours until dawn. It wasn't insomnia, it was survival. The sensory experience was unforgettable. Outside your hut, snow muffles the landscape. You hear only the creak of frozen timbers or the howl of a distant dog. Inside, the smell of smoke clings to your woolen cloak. Your children stir beside you, muttering in half-dreams. You rise, rake the coals, sip a mug of warm ale if you're lucky, and settle back. Maybe you whisper prayers for safety through the night, or maybe you tell your children a tale about St. Nicholas battling demons in the forest. That waking time wasn't wasted, it was memory-making. Winter also sharpened fears. Long darkness meant long exposure to night terrors, both real and imagined. Wolves prowled the edges of villages, their howls carrying through still air. Bandits, too, favored the long black for raids. And spiritually, priests warned that the devil worked hardest in the deep night, planting temptations during half-sleep. Some even cautioned against idleness during the waking gap, urging the faithful to pray instead of dallying in bed. Did people listen? Well, judging by all those references to conjugal visits in midnight hours, perhaps not entirely. Gender roles colored winter nights differently. Women often used the waking time to nurse infants or spin thread by firelight, their hands working while their husbands dozed. Men might check livestock, ensuring animals hadn't frozen. Children, less burdened by responsibility, might simply babble about dreams to whoever was awake. Sleep wasn't just broken, it was tailored to each person's duty. One peculiar tradition tied to long nights was storytelling. The Icelandic sagas, for instance, often mention long evenings spent reciting tales aloud, a way to pass endless hours of dark. Folktales about trolls, elves, and wandering spirits gained extra potency when told at midnight, between sleeps. In fact, some anthropologists believe our entire culture of bedtime stories has roots in those long medieval nights when parents filled the waking gap with tales to soothe frightened children. And yet there's a tenderness in this rhythm. Imagine lying in your hut, hearing the soft hum of your wife's spinning wheel, the pop of firewood, the faint bleat of a goat outside. The night feels endless, yes, but also intimate. When you finally slip back into second sleep, it's with the reassurance that the world has shrunk to your hearth, your kin, and your shared warmth. Fast forward to spring and the pattern shifts. Nights shorten, labor hours lengthen, and the waking interval shrinks or even disappears. But in winter, segmented sleep flourishes. It becomes a necessity and a comfort, a framework for surviving the season. The rhythm of first and second sleep isn't just biological, it's cultural, seasonal, and deeply human. So the next time you groan about how long winter nights drag on, imagine yourself in that medieval bed. First sleep, then a candlelit interlude of prayer or story, then second sleep until dawn. What feels strange to us was simply life for them, a rhythm dictated by the heavens, the earth, and the stubborn tilt of the planet itself. You roll over in your straw-stuffed mattress, only to bump into someone else's elbow. That's the reality of most medieval nights. Beds weren't private cocoons but shared spaces, packed with warmth, whispers, snores, and sometimes fleas. The modern notion of a king-size mattress all to yourself would have seemed absurd. For most of history, sleeping meant sharing, And in that arrangement, the rhythm of first and second sleep became even more communal. Picture the scene. In a peasant's hut, one large bed might accommodate the whole family, parents, children, perhaps even a visiting cousin or two. The mattress, a sack of straw or reeds, changed a few times a year if you were lucky. Blankets were precious, often made of rough wool or patched linen, so everyone huddled close. Privacy, forget it. If you wanted to roll out of bed after first sleep to stir the fire or step outside, you'd be crawling over relatives in the dark. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval records make it clear that bed sharing was common across all classes. Apprentices in urban households often slept in the same bed. Travelers paid to bed share with strangers at inns, not always with the guarantee of clean sheets. Even servants sometimes slept at the foot of their master's bed, available if called upon in the night. For nobles, beds were bigger and more ornate, four-posters draped with embroidered curtains. But they, too, often shared space with attendants or children. A bed was rarely just for two. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some medieval households enforced what was called a bed right. This meant that if a guest stayed the night, they might legally or socially be entitled to share your bed, yes, even if you didn't know them well. The idea was rooted in hospitality and scarcity. Beds were too valuable to leave half empty. Imagine offering a stranger supper, then sheepishly saying, "By the way, you'll be sleeping next to Uncle Robert tonight. Don't hog the blanket." And the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether bed sharing was purely practical or carried deeper symbolic weight. Was it simply about warmth and space, or was it also a deliberate act of kinship, bonding, and trust? Some suggest that lying side by side fostered communal intimacy, reinforcing family ties. Others argue it was necessity stripped of sentiment. No room, no choice. The truth, as usual, is tangled. The architecture of sleeping shaped the rhythm of segmented slumber. When first sleep ended and someone stirred, they often woke others too. A child rolled over, a husband stoked the fire, a servant fetched water, and the bed became a hive of activity. Quiet conversations sprang up in those hours, not unlike the pillow talk couples share today. Parents might discuss crop plans, whisper gossip, or exchange prayers. Children murmured half-remembered dreams. Bed sharing made the waking interval between sleeps less solitary and more communal. Consider the noble household. Their great chamber housed not only the lord and lady, but also pages, ladies-in-waiting, or favored guests. Curtains provided privacy, but the muffled sounds of people shifting or whispering were inescapable. The lord might rise after first sleep to read by candlelight or consult with a steward, while others in the room drowsed or murmured prayers. The chamber wasn't a place of stillness. It was alive with the ebb and flow of segmented rest. Gender roles shaped these nights too. Women often used the waking hours to nurse bobbies, change swaddling, or soothe restless toddlers. Men might slip out to relieve themselves or check animals in the byre. Sometimes these duties overlapped. A husband fetching water for his wife, a mother nudging her older child to help with the fire. Bed sharing meant task sharing, and segmented sleep made space for it. But intimacy also flourished in these hours. Medical manuals and moral treatises alike mention midnight as a favored time for marital relations. After first sleep, bodies were rested, digestion calmed, and the quiet of the night provided cover. Priests might scold against lustful excess, but the rhythm of segmented slumber offered couples a practical window for closeness, tucked between rest and responsibility. Of course, not all bed sharing was cozy. Inns posed their own challenges. Travelers often found themselves pressed against strangers, wary of lice or theft. A popular joke of the era quipped that you went to bed with three strangers: your bedfellow, the fleas, and the lice. Yet the custom persisted, because inns couldn't afford to offer single-occupancy rooms to everyone. Imagine waking from first sleep, fumbling in the dark, and realizing you've tangled blankets with a man whose name you never caught. Bed curtains and canopies, common in wealthier homes, reveal another layer of this culture. These weren't just decorations, they were practical dividers. Curtains trapped heat, muffled sounds, and offered some semblance of privacy in a crowded chamber. Within that small cocoon, the waking gap between sleeps became a liminal space where a couple could whisper secrets or a monk could read quietly while his fellows snored nearby. Children, too, played their part. Many medieval commentators remarked on how children's sleep seemed heavier, more dream-filled, as if their moist humors, remember those, made them drowsy and imaginative. Parents often noted that kids stirred less during the waking interval, allowing adults time for hushed talk. But children's dreams were listened to carefully. A child who woke from first sleep recounting a strange vision might be seen as touched by God or haunted by spirits. Let's not forget servants. In wealthier households, they often slept in hallways or at the foot of beds, ready to be summoned during the waking interval. A lady might ask for water, a lord might demand a cloak, or a sick child might cry out. Servants lived at the mercy of their masters, broken sleep, reinforcing the hierarchy even in the middle of the night. But there's tenderness here too. Picture a cold January night. You and your family have just stirred after first sleep. The fire is poked back to life, casting a golden glow. Your youngest child mumbles a dream about chasing geese. Your spouse reaches for your hand beneath the blanket. For a little while, the darkness feels less oppressive. Sharing a bed and sharing those waking moments builds intimacy in ways modern single beds might never replicate. Even literature reflects this. Tales often describe characters conversing in bed during the night, or dreaming vividly and sharing visions with bedmates. Chaucer, in his playful way, hints at nighttime gossip and games in shared beds. These weren't strange asides. They reflected the everyday texture of medieval nights. So when you picture medieval segmented sleep, don't imagine solitary individuals tossing and turning. Picture crowded straw beds, noble canopies with attendants nearby, inns stuffed with strangers, and families whispering in the firelight. Sleep wasn't just personal, it was social. And that social texture shaped how first and second sleep unfolded. As you close your eyes again for second sleep, you feel the warmth of others pressed around you, hear their slow breathing, and know you're not alone in the dark. Sleep is shared, broken, communal, woven into the very fabric of medieval life. The fire crackles low, your eyelids grow heavy, and just as you drift into second sleep, you feel a weight pressing down on your chest. You cannot move. You cannot breathe. Something is sitting on you. In the pitch black of a medieval chamber, such an experience was not dismissed as a sleep disorder. No, it was a demon, a night hag, or the devil himself, paying you a visit in your most vulnerable hours. For medieval people, the night was never neutral. It was a battleground between forces of good and evil, between angels and demons, between God's protection and the devil's assaults. Segmented sleep meant twice the opportunities for these nightly encounters. Your first sleep might carry you into a dream of celestial beauty, but in the waking hour, fear crept in. As the embers glowed faintly and silence thickened, people whispered of spirits slipping through keyholes, witches riding the air, and imps perching on bedposts. And when second sleep returned, it often carried nightmares born of these anxieties. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Medical and religious texts of the Middle Ages described what we now call sleep paralysis as a supernatural attack. The Latin term incubus literally means to lie upon, and incubus demons were believed to crush their victims in bed. Reports of such night terrors were so common that theologians debated their meaning. Were they punishments for sin, temptations of the devil, or merely the work of malicious spirits testing faith? The experience was real to them, recorded in chronicles, sermons, and medical treatises alike. And here's your quirky tidbit. One folk remedy against these night terrors was to place a pair of iron scissors under your pillow, blades crossed, to ward off evil. Others sprinkled holy water around the bed or slept with a relic, a saint's bone or a pilgrim badge tucked in their mattress. Cats were sometimes allowed to sleep nearby, thought to frighten away demons. Imagine crawling into bed, clutching your rosary with one hand and keeping scissors beneath your straw tick with the other, just in case. But here, where the scholarly debate arises, Historians still argue whether these night visions were interpreted primarily as supernatural attacks or as moral allegories. Some suggest medieval people truly believed demons visited them physically. Others argue that priests encouraged symbolic readings. The incubus wasn't a literal creature, but the weight of sin, lust, or guilt manifesting in dreams. The truth, as usual, likely wove both threads together. To the villager, it was a demon. To the monk writing a sermon, it was temptation clothed in nightmare. Dreams, too, carried both menace and meaning. The first sleep, heavy with digestion, often birthed chaotic and disturbing dreams, monsters, falls, suffocations. The waking interval allowed people to recount these visions, sometimes interpreting them as warnings. The second sleep, lighter and calmer, was said to bring clearer, even prophetic dreams. Priests cautioned against reading too much into these night images, but popular culture teemed with dream books, cheap manuscripts listing symbols and their meanings. Dream of losing teeth. Someone will die. Dream of water. A journey lies ahead. Imagine you and your spouse trading dream interpretations by firelight before second sleep, treating the night as both oracle and trap. And not all fears were invisible. Actual dangers prowled at night. Wolves circled villages, their howls slicing through the dark. Thieves favored the long black for raids. Fires, unchecked, could flare from a single spark. The medieval night was physically dangerous, and so spiritual terrors blended with real ones. To ward them off, people used every tool: prayers to guardian angels, charms whispered before sleep, protective amulets, even the placement of the bed itself. Some texts advised keeping your head toward the east, facing Jerusalem, as a shield against evil dreams. In monasteries, night fears took a different form. A monk rising for matins might stumble through cold cloisters, his lantern sputtering, shadows stretching across stone walls. The silence was broken only by chance, but to him, demons lurked in every corner. Writers like the Venerable Bede or later chroniclers warned monks that the devil prowled especially between midnight and dawn, the demon's hour. Monastic rules urged vigilance: pray, sing psalms, and resist drowsiness. For monks, segmented sleep wasn't just biology, it was spiritual warfare. Folk traditions offered colorful protections. In parts of Germany, people carved magical runes on bedposts. In England, some scattered salt around the mattress. In France, mothers placed knives near their babies' cradles, sharp steel to ward off spirits. One particularly odd charm instructed sleepers to recite the alphabet backward before closing their eyes, confusing any demon who tried to invade their dreams. Imagine the muttered sounds of villagers reciting letters into the dark, all to buy a little peace in second sleep. Even architecture reflected these anxieties. Heavy bed curtains weren't only for warmth, they also symbolized a barrier against the unseen. Thick shutters closed out not just cold winds, but malevolent spirits. Church bells rang at midnight in some towns, not only to mark canonical hours, but to drive away demons. Sleep wasn't passive. It was an act of defense, with ritual and structure guarding the vulnerable body. And yet fear had its uses. Priests often harnessed night terrors in sermons. A dream of fire became a reminder of hell. A crushing incubus was a metaphor for sin weighing on the soul. The devil in your sleep proved the reality of spiritual struggle. Nightmares, instead of being dismissed, were turned into tools for teaching morality. Imagine confessing to a priest that you dreamed of drowning, only to be told it was a sign of your pride dragging you down. Every nightmare became a lesson. But tenderness crept in, too. Parents soothed frightened children after bad dreams, murmuring prayers, stroking their hair, reassuring them that saints watched over the bed. Couples clutched each other in the dark, finding comfort in shared fear. Communities, too, built rituals around night terrors. If someone suffered repeated nightmares, neighbors might advise fasting, pilgrimages, or charms. Fear built solidarity as much as it sowed dread. Even the rhythm of segmented sleep itself may have helped people manage fear. The waking interval provided space to talk, to pray, to light candles, to check surroundings. Imagine how terrifying it would be to lie paralyzed in total darkness for 8 unbroken hours. But if you woke halfway, rekindled the fire, recited a psalm, or whispered to a spouse, the night became less suffocating. First and second sleep weren't just about digestion, they were coping strategies for a fearful world. So as you ease back into your own second sleep, imagine yourself as that medieval dreamer. Maybe you've placed iron scissors beneath your pillow or recited a prayer to Saint Michael. Maybe you've whispered to your spouse about the weight on your chest, both of you convinced the devil was near. The fire glows faintly, the shutters hold firm, and you trust, somehow, that you'll wake again at dawn. Night terrors, demons, and holy protections shape your slumber, reminding you that the medieval bed was never just a bed. It was a battlefield. The embers glow low in the hearth, shadows stretch long across the floor, and you are awake in the deep stillness of night. For most of us today, waking at midnight feels like an inconvenience, a disruption. But in the medieval world, this interlude between first and second sleep wasn't dead time. It was opportunity. Far from being wasted hours, these midnight stretches became a canvas for human activity, labor, learning, devotion, or indulgence. And depending on who you were, those hours could either be holy or scandalous. Start with the most practical. For peasants and laborers, life was built on physical necessity. If a cow calved in the middle of the night, someone had to rise and help. If frost threatened crops stored in a shed, a farmer might get up to check. The waking interval offered time to mend tools by firelight, prepare food for the next day, or spin and weave thread. Picture a woman hunched at her spindle, her hands working quietly as her children dozed beside her. Midnight labor wasn't glamorous, but it was efficient. When daylight was short and work endless, every hour mattered. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Court and household records show that people deliberately used the gap between sleeps for work. In monastic schedules, the nocturnes were built-in hours of worship and reading. In rural accounts, people describe rising at midnight to tend fires, care for animals, or even begin baking bread so that loaves would be ready for the day. This wasn't insomnia, it was intentional productivity. Now for your quirky tidbit. In some places, especially in winter, the midnight gap became a prime time for brewing ale. The process required careful tending, stirring, and checking temperature. Rather than staying awake all day and night, brewers used their waking period between sleeps to check their batches. Imagine trudging barefoot to a back shed in the cold, lantern in hand, just to stir a frothy barrel of ale before creeping back to bed. Midnight wasn't just prayer time, it was brew time. But not all midnight activity was so wholesome. Scholars still debate just how much mischief took place in those hours. Historians argue whether the waking gap encouraged illicit behavior, secret trysts, whispered plotting, even petty crime. There's tantalizing evidence in court records. People caught sneaking out at midnight to meet lovers, to steal firewood, or to gamble in secret gatherings. Was this common, or were these rare exceptions magnified by scandal? The debate lingers, but the very existence of such records proves the interlude between sleeps was fertile ground for secrecy. Education, too, found its place in the night. For those who could read, and that meant mostly clergy, nobles, and a handful of wealthy merchants, the waking hours were perfect for study. Monks illuminated manuscripts, their quills scratching against parchment, bent over pages by candlelight. Scholars in towns like Paris or Bologna reportedly used these quiet hours to memorize texts, free from the noise of the day. Knowledge was precious, and the silence of midnight was a sanctuary. Imagine yourself as a student, mumbling lines of Latin in the flickering dark, your roommates snoring beside you, as you tried to commit Aristotle to memory before second sleep. Of course, not everyone studied scripture or philosophy. Popular literature, romances, folktales, songs, was also recited in these hours. Families gathered around a hearth after first sleep, trading stories before drifting back off. Bedtime stories weren't just for children, they were for everyone. In fact, this is likely one root of our own bedtime storytelling traditions, the shared tales told in the waking interval of segmented sleep. And then there were the secret pleasures. Priests and moralists were quick to warn that the hours between first and second sleep were ripe for sin. Couples used the time for intimacy, seeing it as natural to wake and reach for each other before drifting back off. Confessors, manuals from the era suggest priests often asked married couples whether they overindulged at night. And yet, medical texts sometimes recommended the very same thing. Intercourse after first sleep was thought healthier, since digestion had eased. Between the warnings of priests and the advice of physicians, medieval couples probably just shrugged and did as they pleased. Food, too, slipped into these hours. Some households kept a small stash of snacks, fruit, bread, or ale for the midnight waking. Eating wasn't routine, but neither was it forbidden. Think of it like a medieval midnight snack taken by firelight, shared with a spouse or child who'd also stirred. The difference? No fridge raid, just cold bread and maybe some leftover pottage, spooned straight from the pot. Travelers and night workers lived differently still. Messengers, watchmen, guards, all were expected to move through the dark. For them, the waking hours were filled with vigilance. Town charters describe curfew bells ringing at dusk and watchmen patrolling streets at midnight. These figures lived on the same segmented rhythm, but with more exposure to night's risks. Imagine yourself as a city watchman, packing a frosty cobblestone street, hearing faint voices from taverns where others gathered illicitly between sleeps. And here, another layer, religious devotion. Monks, as mentioned, rose for matins in the dead of night, but ordinary people prayed too. Midnight was considered a potent hour for spiritual connection, a time when heaven and earth drew close. Saints' lives often describe visions or miracles occurring during these hours. Villagers might kneel by their beds, whispering the Pater Noster or invoking a patron saint before slipping back into second sleep. Night was danger, but it was also doorway. Even astrology played a role. Astrologers argued that the stars at midnight exerted special influence, shaping dreams and destinies. Some recommended timing activities, harvest planning, travel, even conception, around the insights gleaned from dreams during first sleep. Midnight, with its in-between quality, became a liminal time, half real, half mystical. So imagine the diversity of the medieval night. One peasant spins wool by firelight. A nobleman writes letters by candle. A monk chants psalms in a chapel. A couple whispers together in bed. A brewer stirs ale. A thief slips down an alley. A child mutters a dream to her mother. The waking interval wasn't uniform. It was as varied as medieval life itself. And through it all, first and second sleep provided structure. People didn't see the night as wasted. They saw it as layered. Sleep, wake, act, sleep again. Each phase had purpose, whether holy, mundane, or mischievous. So as you let your own imagination drift, picture yourself rising from first sleep. Do you tend animals? Do you pray? Do you read by flickering light? Or do you slip out quietly, chasing secret pleasures? Midnight in the medieval world is alive, filled with whispers, labor, laughter, fear, and hope. You settle back into second sleep only after this liminal chapter. This midnight interval has played its part in shaping your night. The room is darker now, the fire nearly gone, the hush so complete you can hear your own breath against the linen pillow. You roll over in the narrow bed, pull the blanket tighter and close your eyes after the midnight waking. Sleep returns, thick and strange, and with it come the dreams. The visions that in the medieval world were not just passing fancies but messages. Sometimes they were signs from God, other times warnings from the body, and occasionally just the absurd ramblings of too much cheese before bed. Either way, people took them seriously, much more seriously than most of us do today. For medieval folk, dreams weren't something you laughed off in the morning. They were woven into the fabric of life, threaded with meaning. The Bible itself spoke of dreamers. Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's visions of fat cows and lean cows, Daniel explaining Nebuchadnezzar's troubling images. To a medieval Christian, dismissing dreams meant ignoring a possible divine telegram. If God had spoken through dreams before, why shouldn't he still? And so, as you drift into your second sleep, you join centuries of people who believed their dreams might change their destiny. Here's your mainstream historical fact. medieval universities actually taught dream interpretation. That's right, you could study somnorum interpretatio alongside theology and law. Scholars built elaborate systems to categorize dreams. Some were natural, caused by bodily states like illness or digestion. Others were spiritual, either divine revelations or demonic temptations. Learned men like Macrobius, a Roman philosopher whose writings were copied and studied well into the Middle Ages, divided dreams into 5 types: prophetic, oracular, enigmatic, ordinary, and false. It wasn't just superstition, it was scholarship. But here comes the quirky tidbit. People honestly believed what you ate before bed influenced not just whether you dreamed, but what kind of dream you'd have. Eating fish, for example, was said to cause watery, strange dreams. Cheese could bring on wild or even prophetic ones. Medical writers warned that heavy or spicy foods disturbed sleep and produced nightmares. So if you ever blame a weird dream on too much pizza, congratulations. You're echoing a medieval idea that a heavy stomach muddles the mind's nighttime visions. Now, scholars still debate whether ordinary peasants shared the same view of dreams as the learned elite. Did the farmer's wife who dreamed of losing a tooth really think it was a sign her neighbor would die? Or was that an invention of educated clerics writing about peasant belief? Court cases, miracle stories, and saints' lives suggest both possibilities. A woman might dream of the Virgin Mary instructing her to visit a shrine, and she'd obey. A man might dream of demons chasing him and see it as a warning against sin. Historians still argue whether these accounts reflect common belief or clerical spin, but either way, dreams mattered. Picture it: after first sleep you rise, tend the fire, maybe share a whispered prayer. Then you slip back beneath the blanket and sink into second sleep. This is the dream-rich period. The silence of the night surrounds you. You see your dead grandfather who tells you to settle a land dispute. You see a field of wheat rotting before harvest and wake with dread. You dream of flying over a forest, only to fall into a river. Are these random firings of the brain or divine messages? To you, living in the medieval world, they are weighty, and you would discuss them with family, friends, or even confessors. Some dreams were so powerful they entered history. Take the case of Constantine the Great, who dreamed of the cross before battle. That story was copied into medieval chronicles, fueling the idea that God might speak through the night. Kings and nobles consulted interpreters, hoping their dreams foretold victory, betrayal, or divine favor. And yet, not only the mighty dreamed. Chronicles also preserve the stories of humble people whose visions led to the discovery of relics or inspired pilgrimages. Dreams cut across class lines. There was also a darker side. Demonic dreams were feared. A nightmare wasn't just a bad experience, it could be an actual attack. People described incubi and succubi, demons who visited sleepers, pressing on their chests, causing suffocation or sinful thoughts. Some medical texts explain these experiences as natural sleep paralysis, but for most medieval folk, it was the work of the devil. Waking from such a dream, you might spit 3 times, whisper a prayer, or reach for holy water kept at the bedside. Better safe than sorry. But not all dreams came with terror. Many were playful or erotic, and these posed their own puzzles. Was dreaming of passion sinful, or was it just the body's weakness? Theologians tied themselves in knots over this question. Some argued dreams were involuntary, so sin wasn't counted. Others worried that indulging in impure thoughts during waking hours encouraged sinful dreams. If you dreamed of the neighbor's handsome son, was that your fault or the devil's trick? Even in sleep, morality loomed. Meanwhile, medical writers explained dreams as the body talking to itself. Galenic theory, with its 4 humors, held that excess bile, blood, or phlegm caused certain dreams. Too much heat in the body, expect fiery visions. Too much cold, you might dream of icy landscapes. Dreams could even diagnose illness. Physicians sometimes asked patients about their dreams, believing the imagery revealed internal imbalances. So if you dreamed of floods, a doctor might decide your body was overwhelmed with phlegm. Dreams were both mystic and medical, sacred and scientific. And then there's the folk side of things. Dream books, cheaply copied texts filled with interpretations, circulated widely. You could buy a little guide that told you what it meant to dream of dogs, loyal friends, snakes, treachery, or teeth falling out, death, always death. These dream books existed in many languages, spreading popular belief. Some even claim to trace their wisdom back to ancient Egypt or Solomon. Imagine peasants by firelight, passing around a dream manual and chuckling, or worrying, about what last night's vision might mean. Let's not forget astrology. The alignment of stars and planets was thought to influence not just your waking life, but also your dreams. Astrologers argued that the moon's position shaped dream imagery, and that certain nights of the lunar cycle produced more prophetic visions. If you dreamed on the 12th night of the moon, that dream was more trustworthy than one on the 20th. Night itself was a map, and your sleep was tied to cosmic rhythms. All of this makes second sleep not just rest, but a stage for communication. Imagine lying back after midnight prayers, drifting into that heavier, dream-soaked state. Your body is warm, the blanket coarse, your breath slow. Suddenly you're in a cathedral filled with light, or standing in a forest, or speaking with someone long dead. You wake, heart racing, unsure whether to tell anyone. Do you keep the dream secret, fearing mockery, or share it, hoping for meaning? And here's something to bring it close. Dreams often became communal. Families told each other their visions in the morning, interpreting together. Some monasteries recorded collective dreams, where multiple brothers saw similar images. A dream wasn't just personal, it was shared, social. In this way, second sleep tied people not just to their bodies and their God, but to each other. So when you, in your own bed centuries later, wake from a vivid dream and brush it off, you're doing something foreign to medieval sensibility. For them, the dream was a riddle worth pondering, a signal worth decoding. Sleep was not passive. It was a dialogue between heaven, earth, and flesh. You sink deeper into second sleep, your mind tangled in imagery, uncertain which visions to trust. And in that uncertainty lies the power of dreams. Half divine, half digestive, always mysterious. Just as medieval scholars argued endlessly, were they prophecy or indigestion? You, too, drift between explanations, carried by the strangeness of the night. The cockerel is still silent, the horizon still dark, but something has shifted. The world you've been traveling through, this medieval landscape of fireside prayers, two-shift rhythms, whispered midnight talk begins to fade. Because segmented sleep, once so ordinary, so natural, so assumed, didn't last forever. It slipped away slowly, replaced by something closer to what we do now. One long, unbroken stretch, the modern night's rest. But why did it change, and what was lost when it did? That's the story we close with tonight. First, let's set the scene. For centuries, people knew no other pattern than first sleep and second sleep. If you told a peasant in 1300 that one day humans would try to cram all their rest into one block, they'd probably laugh or pity you. The idea of lying down at night and not stirring until dawn would have sounded unhealthy, even impossible. Night was layered, structured. The midnight interval was just as natural as the rooster's crow or the church bell. And yet, by the 17th and 18th centuries, something began to unravel. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Historians like Roger Eckhart, who dug into court records, diaries, and medical treatises, found that references to first sleep and second sleep virtually vanished from European texts by the 1800s. Before then, their everywhere legal testimonies, family letters, even plays casually mentioned people rising after first sleep. Afterward, silence. This wasn't coincidence. It was a cultural shift. And here comes your quirky tidbit. One reason segmented sleep faded was coffee. Yes, the little bean that fuels your Monday morning had a hand in ending centuries of broken slumber. Coffeehouses exploded across Europe in the 1600s, keeping people awake later into the night, gathering them into candlelit debate rather than sending them to bed at dusk. With bedtime pushed back, the long gap between first and second sleep began to collapse. Coffee didn't just change mornings, it rewired nights. But historians still argue whether artificial light or industrial discipline was the bigger culprit. The debate goes on. Was it the glow of candles, lamps, and eventually gaslights that stretched the evening into a seamless flow? Or was it the factory bell, demanding workers be up at dawn, that discouraged a two-phase rhythm? Likely both. As cities grew, streets lit, and work hours tightened, people went to bed later and rose earlier, leaving no time for that midnight pause. You can picture the change. In a medieval village, darkness fell, work ended, and beds beckoned. People drifted into first sleep almost with the setting sun. By midnight, they were awake again, tending fires, praying, or chatting. By dawn, they had finished their second sleep and were ready to face the day. But in a London coffeehouse of 1700, merchants argued politics until 2 in the morning, scribes copied accounts by candlelight, and no one thought of first sleep. Bedtime was later, sleep compressed, the interlude erased. Something else shifted too, attitudes toward night itself. In the Middle Ages, the hours after dark carried menace. Night was when demons prowled, thieves crept, fires threatened. But with lamps in the street and neighbors awake, the night lost some of its terror. It became not just survivable, but fashionable. Theater shows stretched into late hours. Musicians played under chandeliers. The night transformed from a time of prayer and rest into a time of leisure and performance. And with that, the need to break the night into two halves diminished. Industrialization sealed the fate. Imagine working 12 hours at a mill, then stumbling home at dusk. Your body craved rest, and your employer demanded punctuality at dawn. No room for leisurely midnight intervals, no tolerance for sleeping in phases. Sleep became another cog in the machine, efficient, compressed, streamlined. One shift of labor, one shift of sleep. Now pause and think of what was lost. Those midnight hours had been a time for intimacy, quiet reflection, spontaneous conversation. Couples reached for each other, neighbors whispered secrets, solitary workers spun wool or stirred ale. Families told stories. People listened for God's whisper. In the rush toward efficiency, much of that faded. Nights became quieter, straighter, less communal. Sleep became private, sealed off, measured in minutes instead of mysteries. And yet traces of segmented sleep linger. Modern sleep studies show that if you cut people off from artificial light, stick them in caves, or just natural cycles, they often revert to two-phase sleep. They sleep a few hours, wake peacefully in the middle of the night, then drift back for a second stretch. It's as if our bodies remember what culture forgot. You too may have woken at 2 or 3 in the morning, alert, restless, wondering why. Maybe that wasn't insomnia. Maybe that was an echo. Medical research even suggests that segmented sleep has benefits. It aligns with natural circadian rhythms. It allows deeper dreaming in the second half. It offers calm wakefulness in the middle. Some psychologists wonder if modern anxieties about insomnia are simply cultural misunderstandings of what used to be normal. Perhaps the medieval villager, rising at midnight to stir the fire, was healthier in his acceptance than we are with our desperate tossing and turning. So here you are, lying in the last segment of our journey, hearing the medieval night recede. You carry a body that remembers first and second sleep, even if your society has forgotten. The change wasn't inevitable, it was historical. Coffee, candles, factories, and fashion pressed us into one pattern, but under the right conditions, the old rhythm still beats. The fire is gone now, nothing left but faint warmth in the stones. The village outside lies silent, the fields damp with dew, the stars paling toward dawn. You've traveled far tonight, through the chambers of peasants and nobles, across monasteries and coffeehouses, along the quiet roads of midnight where dreams and duties mingled. And as the story slows, so does your breath. It's easy to imagine yourself in one of those rooms, lying on a straw mattress, pulling a rough woolen blanket close, listening to the hush. In the gap between sleeps, you might whisper a prayer or share a smile with someone beside you, or simply sit in silence, hearing the creak of wood and the far-off bark of a dog. That was the medieval night, layered, alive, and strangely tender. Now, as your eyes grow heavier, let those images soften and blur. Picture the embers fatting, the sounds of the world dimming, the weight of the blanket pressing you gently toward rest. Whatever lingers in your mind, worries, lists, little scraps of thought, Let them drift away like sparks rising into a dark sky. You are safe. You are still. You are carried by rhythms older than history, rhythms your body still remembers even if the world does not. First sleep, second sleep, waking, resting, each a tide rolling through you. So let the tide take you now. Let yourself sink into the quiet, into the slow breathing, into dreams that will come and go like passing lanterns in the night. You are exactly where you need to be. Good night, sweet dreams.